Are we seeing the rise of a new Confederacy within the United States? And is this form of Antifa, state opposition, and the efforts to block deportations, the pushback against federal law enforcement, is this all part of it? I'll be deep diving into this topic today. And also, on a related point, many officers are doing their jobs, but they're facing lawlessness in their cities. And it's also being revealed part of the reason for it is that officers are being given stand-down orders to not enforce the law on key issues. They're not allowed to do their jobs. I'll be talking about these topics a lot more today. I'm the Epoch Times senior investigative reporter Joshua Philipp, and you're listening to Crossroads. Now, first off, a new movement of resistance is growing all across America. There are efforts to block deportations, to push back against federal law enforcement. And in light of this, commentator and historian Victor Davis Hanson, he's raising an important question. Do these new movements represent a new Confederacy? Has the Confederacy returned to the United States? This is what he says on his website. He says, left-wing protesters are swarming ICE headquarters in Portland to violently oppose all deportations, even those of known criminals and those who have already exhausted efforts to remain here illegally. Why? He says the Democratic Party, apparent, knows that the public wants both secure borders and deportations of illegal aliens. Indeed, in part, it lost an election by its open border advocacy, suggesting that actually border issues was one of the key voting points, right? A lot of Americans voted specifically on that point. But he adds this, but Democrat officials feel that if street thugs like Antifa can surround and besiege ICE facilities in Portland, Oregon, then the deportations will stop and a de facto amnesty will follow for millions who entered the U.S. illegally, which, by the way, would mean that Republicans would never win another election. And he says that would soon become Democratic constituents. All these would become probably Democratic voters because they're the ones standing up for him, right? He says, as a result, they do not fully enforce the law when thugs attack federal law enforcement. Antifa and its spin-off groups favor the night when they try to block all entries and exits of ICE vehicles and personnel and can commit their violence with greater anonymity, which has been happening, by the way. They'll block the entrances and exits of the ICE buildings so ICE actually can't get its vehicles out and let's do it over and over again. And because of the various light on crime laws, well, they can just do it night by night and nobody gets punished for it. They say this, the masked rioters assault anyone in their way. They count on exemption from punishment for committing violence against federal officers through the goodwill or indifference of kindred local and state officials who hate the Trump administration more than they respect the law. An Orwellian scenario follows, in which federal officers are attacked by Antifa, which in turn counts on the non-intervention of local police. He said, summed up, the city of Portland's armed officers are a de facto proxy war with the federal counterparts in our version of something out of the 1860s on the eve of a real civil war. Now, we might not be on the brink of a civil war, but he brings up an important point. Well, it is true, this is an old debate just in modern times with different focus, right? It's also not necessarily partisan, not just Republican, Democrat. When Biden was president, many U.S. states, Florida, Texas, they were also trying to push back against his policies. There was a resistance of the states against the overreach of the federal government. At that time, they were trying to secure their borders, right? Texas got sued by the federal government under Biden for trying to put up border barriers and to enforce border law. The Biden administration wanted open borders for the most part. At that time, there was even a narrative, in fact, from the Biden administration that merely the discussion of federal overreach was a type of extremism. If you believed that federal overreach was a problem, you were branded an extremist. Now, right now, it's not framed that heavily. You're not being investigated or labeled or whatever else if you just believed in, state rights to an extent. But that's how it was. And interestingly now, things are different, right? Trump is president, blue states are the ones resisting his policies, and now it's them talking about state rights and complaining about federal overreach, but taking it a few steps further. They're attacking federal officers, they're blocking the efforts of federal law enforcement, They're even resisting at the state level, letting people off the hook, giving stand-down orders to police, telling police do not enforce the law on these key issues. If you do, you will face criminal charges, even misdemeanor crimes. Now, the specifics are actually very different. The new movements we're seeing right now, they're not just states pushing back against federal policy. They're not fighting against like, hey, we don't want you gender changing our children or throwing the borders wide open. One of the sole historical roles of the federal government is actually to secure the U.S.-Mexico border. If you're not doing it, you're not playing your job, right? The current movement is also about civil unrest, the protection of violent criminals, broad programs that just frankly represent lawlessness, right? Under Biden, it was states mostly standing up against his, woke policies, against DEI and things of that sort. Under Trump, it's states trying to prevent deportations, states trying to protect groups like Antifa while allowing for their violence, allowing for riots, even allowing them to target ICE facilities, even federal agents, even threatening them. How is that legal? One side wanted the law to be enforced, the other side wanted the law to not be enforced. Even during the Biden administration, that was the actual division of state rights. Again, states wanted the laws on the border to be enforced. The federal government did not. And now that the tables are turned, these states, at least the Democrat states, do not want the law to be enforced. The federal government wants the law to be enforced. Victor Davis Hanson said this: America, for almost 200 years, has already decided, and going back to the Civil War, in formal law and court rulings that no local or state entity can disrupt the enforcement of federal laws or usurp Washington's power. To do so with impunity would unravel the American nation in short order. And of course, we see that now. Local district judges blocking the president, overriding the federal government. We see, of course, governors, mayors overriding the federal government. We see, again, even local police departments giving orders not allowing police to enforce the law or giving them stand-down orders to oppose the federal government, right? Victor Davis Hanson says, we know that from our own violent history, Civil War, Andrew Jackson in 1832, like Trump, threatened to send troops to stop South Carolina's nullification of federal tariff laws. Interestingly, because the same thing is happening now where Trump is trying to use tariffs, and South Carolina tried stopping that, and Andrew Jackson was threatening to send troops to stop them from doing it. It's America fought a civil war over Confederate states' efforts to ignore federal law and confiscate or occupy federal property within their state jurisdictions. As late as 1963, Alabama Governor George Wallace thought he could nullify federal law by using a state guard to deny black students enrollment in the University of Alabama, until the Kennedy administration federalized all state troopers and sent in additional federal troops. Again, a state was saying, we're not going to listen to the federal government. The federal government says, if you're not going to enforce the law, and yes, we have civil rights laws, then we're going to send in the troops and force you to abide by federal law. Victor Davis Hanson says, so what we are witnessing in Portland, as we speak, and elsewhere, is a neo-Confederate attempt to supersede federal law and, in reactionary fashion, invoke states' and cities' rights. The exact same narrative of the Confederates during the Civil War. Now, is that the case? I would actually have to agree with Victor Davis Hanson that it's similar. It is actually similar. The arguments right now coming out justifying this are basically the same as what the Confederates were saying during the Civil War. Now, in school, we're taught it was all about slavery. It is true that was the main issue, but the underlying argument on that was state rights. Can the federal government change the laws of the states? If a state wants to have slavery, can the federal government force them to do otherwise? States had relative sovereignty from the federal government on many fronts, and that was the one point. In America, we stand for freedom. Can states violate that? The big answer was no, but we had to fight a war to decide it. Can the federal government force states to adopt laws and policies? That is the key question at hand. And to what extent can states resist that? Again, some would argue when Trump was president, weren't Florida and Texas also resisting, the laws of the federal government? They were, but they were doing it through lawsuits. They were not doing it through civil resistance, through violent movements, through violent riots and things of that sort. The only exception to that you could argue would be January 6th, but Trump, you might remember, did authorize the deployment of the National Guard. And the lawlessness, the lack of deployment of the National Guard was not his choice. It was the choice of several officials on the other side of the aisle. Now, look, going back to what happened during the Civil War, states that resisted federal policies joined the Confederacy. We don't want the federal government's laws. That was the Confederacy. And as Victor Davis Hanson notes, the arguments of the Confederates then actually are not different from the substance of the arguments now from states resisting federal policies. He says this, quote, "Bringing in federal forces to uphold the law will also protect the rights of ICE personnel and neighborhood residents to live in peace and security and have their constitutional protections secured. Not all American citizens are Portlanders, but all Portland citizens are Americans." The big argument, right? Are you a state citizen or are you a federal citizen, an American citizen? That's a big question. Victor Davis Hanson says in both words, both Antifa and the appeasing Oregon officials are our new neo-Confederate secessionists. They feel that their states are now autonomous entities that are still entitled to federal money. They should still get our tax dollars, but not obligated to follow federal laws. Is that the case? I think he might be onto something. Now, on a related point, many officers are actually doing their jobs. We shouldn't blame this on police officers. They're actually trying to enforce the law in most regards. But they're facing lawlessness in their cities, and it's also now being revealed why that is. In some instances, police officers are being given stand-down orders to not enforce the law on key issues. I'll be talking more about this after we come back from a quick break.
All right, just to pause here for a super quick moment. You are, of course, watching Crossroads with Joshua Philipp. I'm just here to share a message about American Hartford Gold, my own personal gold and silver bullion dealer. Now, obviously, the recent tariffs have made the markets super turbulent and volatile. With every new piece of tariff news, the markets seem to either crash up or crash down. And of course, it's worth mentioning that these conditions don't only affect Wall Street. They affect all of us through our investments and our retirement accounts. That's why I'd like to introduce you to a company that I trust and I myself use to secure my own savings, American Hartford Gold. They specialize in helping Americans move our assets into something tangible, into something you can actually hold, which is physical gold and physical silver, two precious metals that act as a hedge against all those decisions being made in Washington, D.C. They have an A+ rating with the Better Business Bureau. They have thousands of 5-star reviews, and they make the whole buying process super simple. Your metals can be shipped directly to your door, or you can transfer your current retirement account to a tax-advantaged gold IRA. And the best part is that right now, American Hartford Gold is offering an exclusive offer. When you call them today and you mention the name Joshua, you could receive up to $15,000 in free silver with your initial investment. Take advantage of their special offer. You can either just call them at 877-260-2764 or text Joshua to 65532. All their information will also be down in the description box below. And now, back to Crossroads.
Welcome back. Many police officers are doing their jobs, but they're not able to do it fully because they're facing lawlessness in their cities, and many of them, it turns out, are being forbidden from cooperating with federal authorities on issues like deporting criminal aliens, since under sanctuary city laws, police officers actually could face misdemeanor criminal charges if they cooperate with federal authorities. Who is making those laws? Not the police officers, it's the local officials. In some instances, officers have even been given stand-down orders to not enforce the law on key issues, including apparently not to arrest Antifa, to allow them to target federal officers, to let them do what they want. Don't arrest them. The Gateway Pundit says this: uncovered Chicago Police Department radio transmissions reveal that local cops were explicitly ordered to ignore distress calls from federal agents who are pinned down and ambushed by armed rioters in the city's Brinkton's neighborhood on Saturday morning. It says this outrageous stand-down directive left brave federal officers to fend for themselves against a coordinated attack, forcing them to fire and wounding one female assailant who had rammed a DHS vehicle with her car. Their lives were in danger. Local police ordered, do not assist them. It's actually similar in New York. In Rochester County back in March, police officers were actually punished because they answered a call for help from federal authorities. They were actually publicly condemned by local officials for doing so. Huge event. They all come out and they condemn the police officers for enforcing the law. They condemn the police officers for assisting federal authorities. Now, mind you, in the United States right now, you had a child killer. A guy broke into a home, murdered, stabbed to death a child, went on, stabbed the family, assaulted the whole family. He's off on parole. He got a very slap on the wrist little charge. And they're saying he's a non-violent offender because apparently murdering a child is not violent because they say he was mentally ill. You don't have public officials coming out en masse condemning that. Why do they come out en masse condemning police officers for assisting federal agents who are being attacked? Good question, right? Now, in light of this, the Trump administration is actually sending its own law enforcement to states. This is why they're doing it. They're even using the military in some cases because the allegation is if local police are being restricted from assisting or protecting federal agents. If federal agents can be attacked, their lives are in danger, cars ramming into them, people with guns sometimes, and police are being told you're not allowed to help them, how can it be that federal agents can safely do their jobs unless the federal government steps in? Good question, right? In Illinois, where Trump is launching an anti-crime and deportation initiative in Chicago, he's currently deploying the National Guard. In fact, about 400 members of the Texas National Guard, they were just sent in. This is why they're doing it. Local officials are even trying to disrupt this. In fact, among the latest moves in that, they've established ICE-free zones. They're saying ICE cannot operate here, Immigration Customs Enforcement. They allege that federal agents will not be permitted to carry out their efforts in some locations. Safe zones, places where federal government cannot go, autonomous cities you might call them. Places breaking away from the federal government. What do you call that? That is a new Confederacy. This is Chicago Mayor Johnson making the announcement on this. Watch.
And today we are signing an executive order aimed at reining in this out-of-control administration. The order establishes ICE-free zones. That means that city property and unwilling private businesses will no longer serve as staging grounds for these raids.
And on that point, while local officials are moving to protect illegal immigrants from deportation, moving to, to protect states from federal law enforcement, President Donald Trump is also facing challenges on whether or not he has the ability to bypass this using the National Guard. Not only are they saying that federal agents, even if they call for help, even if they say we're under attack, police are told, do not help them. The president's being told, you cannot deploy assets to help them either. Local states, police can't protect them, and the president himself is being told, you cannot protect them. The only option then is, look, Mr. President, don't try to enforce the law. These states act on their own laws. Do not try to enforce the law. That's the message being sent. In many states, this has actually resulted in lawsuits and other efforts aiming to block the President of the United States. The Guardian says this in one new example. Addressing reporters today, Illinois Governor J.B. Pritzker said today that he plans to use every lever to resist the power grab from the Trump administration to quell protests in Chicago by deploying National Guard troops. It says the state has now filed a lawsuit to block the president's move to federalize troops. Earlier, a federal judge did not block the deployment immediately, but has given the Justice Department 2 days to respond in writing to the state's temporary restraining order motion. The next hearing is set for Thursday. Now, in response to the lawsuit from Oregon, Attorney General Harmeet Dillon wrote on X, quote, "Yet another lawless attack on our very system of government. The president commands our military, not federal judges, out of control." And on that point also, Among the National Guard troops set to deploy to Portland are some from California. And California Governor Gavin Newsom is moving to block this from happening. This is what Gavin Newsom says on his own website. Quote, Governor Gavin Newsom today issued the following statement in response to the Trump administration deploying 300 California National Guard personnel into Portland, Oregon, after a federal district court blocked the attempted federalization of Oregon's National Guard. And Gavin Newsom said directly, quote, in response to a federal court order that blocked his attempts to federalize the Oregon National Guard, President Trump is deploying 300 California National Guard personnel into Oregon. They're on their way there now. This is a breathtaking abuse of law and power. The Trump administration is unapologetically attacking the rule of law itself and putting into action their dangerous words, ignoring court orders and treating judges, even those appointed by the president himself, as political opponents. It is true, notably, that the recent block on Trump was actually from one of his own appointed judges. But Gavin Newsom adds, quote, this isn't about public safety, it's about power. The commander-in-chief is using the U.S. military as a political weapon against American citizens. I'd say not all of them are citizens. Actually, I'd say most of them are not. But he adds, quote, we will take this fight to court, but the public cannot stay silent in the face of such reckless and authoritarian conduct by the President of the United States. Again, states versus the federal government. And in Portland, there are actually some new issues on the ground as well. Some people are getting arrested in front of the ICE facilities and other locations. It's happening. People are being arrested. There are protests taking place. Antifa's out there. They're throwing fireworks at police. They're throwing rocks at police. They're blocking the entrances and exits with their vehicles. Again, ICE personnel cannot carry out their operations, and arrests are happening. The only problem is it's not Antifa being arrested. It's actually journalists, and mostly conservatives, well, all conservatives. The people being arrested are not Antifa or the people protesting. Instead, they're arresting conservatives trying to expose it. Andy No, with a Post-Millennial, wrote this on X. He said, quote, in Oregon's emergency lawsuit to prevent the president from sending troops to protect federal property, a disturbing email from Portland Police Sergeant Andrew Braun was included. In it, Braun blames the victims of Antifa violence for their own assaults and attacks. How dare you be attacked by Antifa? Straight to jail you go. Obviously, Antifa is the arm that decides who is guilty and innocent, and if they attack you, the victim, apparently you're the criminal, not them. It says Braun claims that journalist Katie Daviscourt, citizen journalist Honey Badger Mom, and conservative activist Rain D. Amakar are somehow responsible for being attacked by protesters. He falsely labels, again Andy No says, he falsely labels Daviscourt and Shelley Bofrock as counter-protesters and accuses them of trespassing on federal property. How is it that journalists being attacked by Antifa are the ones being, again, charged of trespassing, when Antifa is out there every night and they're being given stand-down orders to not go after them? And says, quote, in reality, these journalists stay near or on federal property because when they're on public streets in Portland, the Portland police will not bother to investigate if they are assaulted or robbed. And Andy is correct on that. There were actually videos of journalists being assaulted and robbed, and it was the journalists, not Antifa, who were criminally charged on that also. Andy says this, Sergeant Braun is essentially parroting Antifa talking points, which justify violence against those they deem unwelcome in public areas they lay claim to. Antifa regularly argues that anyone they label as an antagonizer, such as the press, is fair game for violent retaliation. And Andy knows that personally because he was actually attacked, chased, beaten, even had a brain hemorrhage because he was attacked by Antifa in Portland. And he actually had to flee not just Portland, but the entire country because they've been threatening him this entire time ever since. But he says this, the leadership mindset or policy helps explain why Portland police have systematically failed to protect conservatives from being beaten or robbed by Antifa and the violent far left over the years. And again, Andy Ngo would know this because as a journalist himself, he has been a victim of that. Now, on a related point, some of the arguments against Trump's efforts are that crime levels are not as bad as he says. They're saying, look, Mr. President, you're wrong. You don't need to send in the military. You don't need to send them in. We're fine. Look at the crime statistics. Crime is not as bad as you say it is. You're saying especially it's not bad enough to justify the federalization of this area, right? Now, that was particularly one of the main arguments against Donald Trump when he moved to federalize Washington, D.C. A lot of legacy news outlets argued crime in the city is going down. Trump, why would you do this? You don't need to federalize Washington, D.C. It turns out, though, that local officers are saying that crime went down because the higher-ups were altering the numbers. Crime didn't go down. They were just changing the numbers to make it look like crime went down. Now, I've been saying this for a while now because this was actually public. The media knew this, and they've been lying to you. But guess what? They're starting to change that now because the Washington Post has broken ranks, and they're actually reporting what many of them reported even months before this, which I've been reporting the entire time. They say this, quote, some rank and file officers and detectives have complained for months because we've been reporting it for months, by the way, in some cases years, that managers were recording serious crimes as more minor ones to make their police districts appear safer or avoid the ire of top department brass. Some kept lists documenting cases where they believed a higher-up improperly classified a crime as a lesser offense. One such tally obtained by the Washington Post lists more than 150 instances since March 2024 where staff in a Southeast D.C. police district believed offenses were at least initially inappropriately classified. At the heart of the Justice Department probe, and another by a House committee, again, the Trump administration is investigating, as are House Republicans, is whether there has been a widespread effort to intentionally downplay crime on city streets. Have they been not documenting crime? Have they been falsely labeling crime? Are child murderers not being labeled as violent criminals? Are child murderers being allowed back on the street? Yes, they are. Yes, they absolutely are. This is happening. Washington Post says this, criminologists say classifying crimes is a often subject and evolving process. Incidents can be redefined as investigators uncover more evidence, and disagreements don't necessarily point to corruption. If somebody's arrested and you don't charge them, is it still a crime? If somebody steals a car and you let them go, is it still a crime? Well, in Washington, D.C., there are people who are repeated car thieves who say, why are you arresting me, officer? You know I'm just going to be back out again tomorrow. You know every single time they call me in and I just don't show up and nothing happens, you don't call my crimes crimes. Is it still crime if you don't designate it a crime or if you don't enforce the law? That is the question for D.C. and actually other parts of the United States. Is Antifa violent if you never charge them with violence? Is assault on officers an assault on an officer, throwing rocks at them, attacking them, if you don't criminally charge them for it, as they are not doing? Well, that's a good question, right? Now, Washington Post says this, in D.C., officers and supervisors have clashed over details such as whether an offense was a robbery or a theft, or whether a weapon was used in an assault qualified as potentially deadly. Well, yes, it was a knife, officer, but was he using it in a deadly way? Good question. They had this. Some of the police force say these arguments are part of a pattern of manipulation by supervisors to achieve a long-term appearance of violent crime reduction. And look, I'd say, look, I guess that's one way to lower crime. You just stop calling crime crime. Hey, crime went down because I stopped counting it. Way to do it, right? This was actually, again, already known. A lot of the media right now is being extremely dishonest and disingenuous. They already knew this. Most major news outlets actually reported on this even a few months ago. Stories of the same allegations, they were coming out before Trump federalized Washington. Most of the legacy media reported it. When Trump federalized Washington, they all wrote it off. They claimed otherwise because the federal program was starting that these activist journalists, I don't know if you call them journalists, these activists were writing in their publications and claiming otherwise when they themselves had reported the opposite just months earlier. They knew they were lying to you. They knew they were lying because their own publications said it before it became political. Now look, it's interesting to see the narratives are now switching back again. Maybe part of that is because the federal government is investigating and these liars don't want to be caught lying. The Washington Post in particular is noting that there were cases of local officials altering the stats on crime to make them lower. I'd say they knew this already, but it's good they're reporting it. That said, questions, comments, anything you want to talk about, leave it in the chat. Let's jump into a discussion. Let's see here. All right. First question, Tree of Liberty. You're saying, I have seen this group in action in Portland, Oregon, and they get away with almost anything. They need to be stopped, but I'm not sure what we as a state and community even do if law enforcement can't, and the state won't prosecute them. Well, it's a tough issue. You know, I can actually tell you, because remember, you know, I was covering January 6th. I was there that day as a journalist. I was there early morning when Trump was speaking at the Ellipse. The story a lot of people have been told is very different from what you've been presented with, or what actually happened. Remember, on January 6th, and this is related, I'll explain how it relates. On January 6th, there were three things scheduled. Donald Trump was going to speak at the Ellipse, which he did. Then he was scheduled to speak in front of the Capitol building. They had a speaker permit there. They had, again, a stage set up. There was a scheduled speaking event at the Capitol building. When Trump ordered people to go there, he was telling them go to the next part of the event, which had licenses, which had permitted speakers, which was organized. The state, again, the city knew about it. It was approved. They had the permits for it. It was all there. The other thing was supposed to happen is that members of Congress, Republicans, were supposed to go over every drop of evidence of election fraud in front of the entire world. And when Trump was saying, watch the show, when Trump was making statements saying that, that's what he was referring to. Trump wanted the world to see all of the evidence of what he was claiming. That's what was supposed to happen on January 6th. What happened instead? Well, what happened instead was that while Trump was still speaking at the Ellipse, before he told people go to the Capitol, a large group of people were at the Capitol. They tore down the barriers. They tore down the no trespassing signs. They tore it all down so that people coming later did not see the no trespassing signs. So that people coming later did not have the bicycle rack set up. There were no climb fences. There were no riot police. There was no National Guard, even though Trump had asked for all of this. Why was that? Fair question to ask, right? But on the point of Portland, I can say one other thing, which is that I remember talking to people in the crowd that day, and the perception was this. Democrats, the left, at that time, remember, Americans were told to lock down in their houses, churches were shut down, places of worship closed. If a pastor opened their church, they could be criminally charged. Meanwhile, strip joints, marijuana dispensaries, they were allowed to stay open. Meanwhile, Antifa was allowed to protest on the street. We were told to socially distance. People were able to go out on the street, burn down buildings, light neighborhoods on fire, rob stores. Everybody was sitting locked down in their homes, forced to watch this. And people said, well, I guess we're allowed to act like that. They came nowhere close to acting that way. But the perception was, maybe this is the law now. Maybe we're allowed to protest. Maybe we're allowed to get a bit rowdy. And they did. They didn't go that far. As opposed to the many lies you've been told, no police officers were killed on January 6th, not a single one. The only people who died that day were Ashley Babbitt, shot in the neck, unarmed tiny women shot in the neck by a guy on the other side of the door, Officer Byrd. Later on, at other parts of that, 2 people died of heart complications. It's not clear whether explosive munitions thrown into the crowd had anything to do with that. Violations of use of force, those types of things, we don't know. The allegations that officers were killed, that happened afterwards. One officer died of complications afterwards. It's not clear the cause of that. Had nothing to do with protesters. And so you've been lied to over and over and over again. You have been lied to by the media. At least not this media, but a lot of the others, right? Now, on that point too, I can say that the perception was, look, the law is not being enforced. People are being allowed to protest. They're even burning down buildings. They burned down, right, BLM and them, they lit on fire the church across the street from the White House. And when Donald Trump was trying to go there, they blamed Donald Trump for using tear gas on the crowd. The media wasn't saying, hey, BLM lit a historical church on fire. They said, how dare the president, use tear gas on a peaceful crowd that was peacefully lighting a church on fire. If that was a mosque, what do you think the narrative would have been? If that was, let's say Trump supporters rioting, burning down a mosque across the street from the White House, what do you think the narrative would have been? The media tells you that Trump uses tear gas and they don't even tell you they lit a historical church on fire. What is wrong with the media these days, right? Anyways, another question. Martin McKenzie, you're saying, isn't Antifa already a terrorist organization? Doesn't that mean the feds can just wipe them out? It is true that Donald Trump has now designated Antifa a major terrorist organization. That does open the doors for a lot of things. So what does it mean when you get a terrorist designation? Well, let's go back to the old Bush administration, right? George Bush says, we're going to smoke them out. I'm a war president. And George Bush passes the Patriot Act, right? The Patriot Act overrides some constitutional rights because the argument is you can't wait for a terrorist attack to happen before you enforce the law. Normally, the law is enforced only after a crime is committed. But when you have terrorists plotting attacks to kill, tens of thousands of people, flying airplanes into buildings or otherwise, what do you do in that case, right? You can't wait for them to commit the crime. You got to do something before. So the anti-terrorism laws represented a type of pre-crime. They represented a type of necessity of surveillance. And what that resulted in was different programs, different technologies to monitor online communications, to criminalize certain types of radicalization, to allow for detention of people who had not yet committed a crime, but were at least suspected of desiring to commit a crime. And it also got into things like radicalization. Now, some people argue, well, Antifa is not an organization. They're lying to you. They have training, they have facilities, they have finances, they have programs, they have leaders, they're organized groups. This is just stupid media being dishonest to you. This is just journalists being dishonest. They're organized. They're organized in every single sense of the term. But there are also unofficial ones. But if you understand that in light of terrorism, you also had what are called lone wolf terrorists. Not every terrorist was a member of ISIS. Not every terrorist was an official, card-carrying member of some terrorist organization. A lot of them were what you call lone wolf terrorists, people who become self-radicalized. They go online, they read the materials, they read Osama bin Laden's manifesto, which was going viral on TikTok, by the way. And who controls the algorithm for TikTok? The Chinese Communist Party. How was it that Osama bin Laden's manifesto justifying violence against civilian populations was allowed to go viral on TikTok? Well, ask the Chinese Communist Party that, because they influence the algorithm. If you became radicalized through that, then you could be called a lone wolf terrorist, right? The Patriot Act allowed for surveillance and sometimes arrests. And so what the terrorist designation does, it allows for certain types of surveillance of communications, types of surveillance of individuals, surveillance of networks, infiltration of networks. It allows also for targeted attacks, including killing of terrorists. And we're seeing that now being used against some drug cartels, particularly outside the United States. We've not really seen it done inside the United States so much. at all at this point. But it does open the door for that. We'll see what Trump does with it because the powers are now there. My personal understanding of this, just where I see this personally going, I think the first stage, they're going to map the networks, they're going to map the members, the leaders, they're going to map how people communicate, how they're radicalized. They're going to map the financial networks, the business networks, the political networks. Notably, I was actually reading last night Andy Ngo's book, Unmasked, about Antifa. A lot of Antifa organizations are actually operated under communist and socialist organizations. Notably, Rose City Antifa is under the Democratic Socialists of America. What other elected officials are members of the Democratic Socialists of America, I might ask? They're actually the parent organization of Antifa, at least Rose City Antifa. And in fact, they even used to write on their placards the name of their organization. They stopped doing it. But I remember back in like 2020 and stuff, they used to write it. They stopped doing that, but they used to. Communist Party USA, different violent communist organizations, the Revolutionary Communist Party, they're part of these organizations. And going after Antifa means you're going to have to go after the parent organizations. And what these parent groups do is every time there's a new issue, migration, black identity politics, Latinx politics, resist X movement, whatever, they just start new NGOs and they run the they start protests and they have their professional protesters show up and they start agitation programs. And they of course, they have a lot of friendly cohorts in the media. Some people in the media even claim to be members of this. Those individuals cover it, favorable coverage, lie, cheat, everything else. Andy Ngo actually writes notably in his book Unmasked that New York Times has even made false reports on Antifa narratives while writing off the truth. They've actually done this, raising some questions over, are there media who are involved in this as well? Fair question to ask, right? So after the investigations happen, I believe then the crackdown is going to happen. We'll see if it ever comes to that, because frankly, we've been watching this for a decade and it has never happened. But maybe things are different now because Trump actually does have a terror designation. Ashley from California, you're saying the amount of people who think it's okay to engage in violence with law enforcement is insane. Is this a result of the propaganda in schools and on TV/online? Possibly. I mean, that's a good point. What is actually radicalizing people? What I've come to realize is that everybody tends to operate on a spectrum of good and evil. And I'm not saying everyone who disagrees with me is evil. I mean, everybody operates on some kind of concept of what is good. Everyone likes to believe they're the good guy, right? When it comes to, for example, myself and maybe a lot of you, I think we operate on more traditional forms of morality, whether it's a philosophy or a religion, right? I would imagine most of us operate on more of a grounded concept of morality. When people don't have that, they view morality based on personal morality. And personal morality is influenced by two things, either by external forces or by just, what is good for me. A lot of people operate like sociopaths, for example. A sociopath's system of morality is based purely on, is this good for me? Not, is this good for my country, which would be like patriotism, like a patriotic morality. Is this good for the future? Some cultures like Native Americans talk about the seventh generation. You should act in line with what is good for the children and your children's children, all the way down to 7 generations. Is it good for them? Is it good based on my religion? My religion teaches me that I should turn the other cheek. My religion teaches me I should be kind to others. I should be forgiving. Is this good in line with that? Right? There's different spectrums of morality. The problem we have these days, and I'd say this is a problem of socialism, socialism, which is just the political form of communism, right? Communism is technically the negation of all systems. But socialism is communism practiced within a system. When a government is practicing communism, the form it takes is socialism. Socialism teaches a type of social morality. Basically the idea of political correctness. Political correctness, going back to Mao Zedong 1967, was a government-run moral system. What is good? What is evil? Basically under Mao Zedong, the definition of this was that government action determines good and evil. If the communist regime says killing your neighbor is good, then that is what is good. If the communist regime says that planting flowers in your yard is evil, then that is evil, which are direct examples, by the way. At the time during the Cultural Revolution, if a woman wore makeup, if you put flowers in front of your yard, you could be considered a rightist, and you were deemed evil. They could even kill you for it. If a person had like grime and dirt on them and filth under their fingernails, they said that that was the look of a hardworking person, and that was good. You were supposed to be filthy. That was good. If the Communist Party says to go and kill the counter-revolutionaries, that was also good. Killing monks, killing abbots, killing priests, tearing down churches, desecrating temples, that was good because the government said so. The communist regime said so. So it was a government-run moral system. This is actually explained, and I'm relating this, so just hear me out. This is actually explained to me by a friend of mine, Chinese expat, fled to the United States, and he was actually saying this is why the CCP persecutes religion. Why does the Chinese Communist Party care if people believe in God? It's the stupidest thing to care about. It makes you a better person. With most religions, it makes you a better person, right? I'd say believing in God will give you a higher sense of morality, a more grounded morality. Normally, not all people follow it. And so for a government to want to kill people for believing in God is kind of stupid, right? It's kind of stupid. Why would you want people to not be kind to each other? Why would you want people to not be honest with each other? Why would you want people to believe that stealing is wrong and these types of things? Why? The reason for the Chinese Communist Party is that the CCP wants to dictate good and evil. And if a more deep belief is overriding the definition of good and evil, they don't control it. And so religion is a direct threat to the Chinese Communist Party's power. They want to control not just society, but also human morality. And they want to decide, basically if they commit a crime, if they do something, they don't want the people saying, hey, what you're doing is wrong. The party is always right or wrong. This is why in China, if you have the 10 Commandments in your wall at a church, they say you cannot have the first commandment, that you shall place no other God before him, right? Because the Chinese Communist Party, in their view, is supposed to come before God. You're not allowed to have that one. When it comes to people right now, the reason people believe that it's okay to engage in violence against police, the reason they believe it's okay to murder white people, the reason they believe it's okay to commit crimes against people who have something you don't have, the haves and the have-nots, is because the media and the political system for 10 years or more now has been telling them that it's okay. They've been saying ACAB, right? Denigrating police officers. They've been saying defund the police. Antifa's been saying all police are fascists. They've been saying that police are evil. They've been saying that white people are responsible for every wrongdoing historically. They've been labeling these things, and they've been agitating, suggesting that violence is necessary to overthrow historical oppression. Even Abram X. Kendi, in books that your children are reading in school, are being told that discrimination is justified to eliminate discrimination, that they need to engage in discrimination to fight discrimination. They believe racism is necessary to fight racism. They believe hate is necessary to fight what they believe is hate. And when you're a hammer, everything looks like a nail. And so they label everybody who doesn't look like them, ironically, as what they hate. They become everything that they hate. They become racists, they become sexists, they become psychopathic terrorists, they become murderers, and they do this because they believe that they're doing good. by killing, by harming, by stopping the people they've been told are the ones doing evil. Not based on true history, not based on real information, but based on what they've been taught in schools under things like the New York Times dishonest, fake 1619 project, based on fake things they've been taught in schools under all these, DEI policies, based on revisions to civil rights laws, and based on political narratives pushed by, the big corporate media. That's what's happening, right? And so these people believe they're doing something good. They believe they're doing something good because of their warped, disgusting standards, frankly. Seymour Butts, you're saying, hey, talking about the CCP infiltrating our country, I read that several large city police departments have received donations of droves from China, and they took them. Can you imagine a CCP drone sitting in a police... Oh, you're saying drone, wow. Drone sitting in a police department, and what info the CCP, could gather from that drone. It is amazing how naive we are. This is an excellent example of a Trojan horse. Okay, so you're saying that police departments across the United States have been receiving donations of Chinese-made drones. I actually am aware of this because I've talked to police officers who operate the drones. This is the problem. The types of drones you need, all the advanced drones, are basically only manufactured in China. That's the problem. There have been some police departments that have banned Chinese-made drones, but they had to overturn it because, unfortunately, because of the market, almost all the drones are manufactured in China. Now, the Trump administration is trying to change that. They are trying to change it, but as of now, there's just no way around it. And it is a problem because the drones have cameras, the drones have internet connections, the drones have sensors. It is very possible that information being gathered by these drones is being relayed back to China. We don't know if that's the case, but we've seen it over and over and over again with Chinese-made electronics. Police, of course, a lot of them now use drones as a core part of their operations. Police will use drones for reconnaissance. They'll use it for big events when they want to make sure there's no crazy person trying to launch an attack. They're very common now in law enforcement. A lot of the drone operations are not super official, but it is police officers realizing, if there's a barricaded suspect, they can send a drone in first, and it means that if they find a guy hiding in a closet with a gun, an officer's not going to risk getting shot. You know what I mean? For them, look, I would do it too. If I had a choice of walking into some barricaded house and you have some guy being like, you're on sovereign land, with his shotgun hiding in somewhere in the house, I would rather have a drone go in and look for the guy than have to play hide and go seek with him, personally. You know what I mean? But the problem is, with the markets, there just are not drones. There are not the real big drones, the drones that they need, that are manufactured basically anywhere else. As of now, the Trump administration, they are working on changing that. There are programs to start production of drones. Part of the problem we've had is the way the CCP has been manipulating the free market. They get trade deals, de minimis. They of course don't have to pay proper amounts of money on shipments, a lot of things like that. And because of this, you have state-run Chinese companies that can operate at a loss, so they can create monopolies. They can put their competitors out of business, then they hike up the prices. So the CCP has been manipulating the free market to create monopolies. I think a lot of countries now are trying to stop that from happening. And especially when it comes to technologies that do represent a threat, like police drones, for example, they are trying to start up domestic production in order to fix that problem. So hopefully that'll change soon. I know there are some efforts currently underway to change that, but we're not quite there yet. Moldy Guard, you're saying anyone with a reasonable mind can look at the nation and see the problem areas as blue. Yeah, I mean, it's not entirely that way, but a lot of it is. And, a lot of this comes down to just lawlessness. A lot of it comes down to the fact that, let's put it this way. Because of DEI policing, because of defund the police, because of movements like, these DAs who've gotten elected saying they're going to enforce the law based on race, you have a lot of criminals who are not being criminally charged. You have a lot of people who, again, there's this horrible case right now. A guy murdered a child, broke into a home, stabbed a little kid to death, went on, attacked the family, and the guy's not even labeled as a violent offender because they say, oh, well, you know what, his race, they're not saying it directly, but we all know it's the case. His race, there's too many of them in prison, we can't do it to him. It's DEI politics, right? Diversity, equity, and inclusion. And I'm saying this because this is what the people funding these DAs were even saying. George Soros himself, when he wrote his op-ed in the Wall Street Journal, this is what he said. I'm not saying this based on rumor or anything else. He was saying there are too many black people in prison, and he's saying it's racist, basically. And he's saying that there's a reason for this, and it's probably because the police are enforcing the law one way and not the other. They're basically saying the problem is socioeconomics, not because of actual crime. And people believe they could change this dynamic by changing the socioeconomics. Hey, give them more money. We need rehabilitation programs. We need social workers, not police. It's problematic because, look, I know people want to talk about race, but even in these communities, it's usually like a very, very, very small portion of people who commit most of the crimes. It's like 1%. Oftentimes what you have are kids who get into crime, when they're young teens, they never face proper repercussions for it. They continue committing crimes. They're in and out of the criminal justice system their entire teenage years. And then when they're adults, what do? They've been criminals their entire lives. They have mental problems by this time, right? They failed at their educations. They can't read. They're, by definition, mentally disabled a lot of times. And they have no way of making a living in society. They've basically gotten themselves into a state where there's nothing they can do to survive other than be criminals. And what do you do with people like that? This is how you get people who are like 14 times repeat offenders. And I know people want to play race politics. Like a lot of these people, their main victims are people of their own race. Like their own communities are being terrorized by them. Like they terrorize their own communities. And, this is why there have been a lot of reports of police going to Washington, D.C., and people are cheering them on. Like, thank you, finally. People are afraid to send their kids out. They're afraid to let their kids out of the house because they're worried their kids are going to get shot. And the guy who shoots their kids is going to go to jail with a slap on the wrist, and before the ink dries on the paper, he's walking free again. You know what I mean? Like, is it fair to let communities be victimized like this? And the problem is, too, one of the reasons people don't commit crimes is because of the threat of punishment. If you remove the threat of consequence, what's going to stop you from committing crime? The only thing that would stop you is a moral foundation. But if people are turning against traditional morality, or if they're being propagandized in schools to believe that it's right and okay to steal if somebody has something you want, if you're being propagandized in school to believe that crime against opposite races is okay because of historical wrongdoing, then what is your moral foundation? It's going to be on that, and people are acting on it. And so it is deeply unfortunate. It's also deeply unfortunate. You can barely even have these arguments these days. You can barely even have a discussion on this without offending somebody these days. It's disgusting. It's crazy. We need to address this as a country. We do need to address this as a country because it again is causing a lot of the problems, a lot of the crime. And, it's fair to say maybe we need more social workers, maybe we need, rehabilitation. Well, we've been trying that for the past 10 years. Has it worked? No, very much the opposite. It has not worked. Absolutely has not worked. On the point of the social workers, I know in California, okay, so they're saying that, with certain types of crime, we want to send in social workers, people who are mentally ill, right? People who are mentally ill, and domestic violence incidents. Do you know that the most dangerous calls a police officer can go on, the calls a police officer is most likely to be shot and killed on, are domestic violence calls? Domestic violence and traffic stops. So those are the two most dangerous for police. You want to send a social worker, an unarmed social worker, to deal with the most dangerous calls. I know in California, I was told this by police, in some areas, the social workers refuse to go on calls without police protection because they're getting assaulted and killed. They don't want to die, right? Because those are the most dangerous calls. And this is what happens when you have people being like, oh, we want to do what's good for everybody, and they're not looking at like the actual context or details. Like it sounds great on paper, right? Hey, we want to send you a therapist. Hey, repeat criminal who's, stabbed people and attacked people for 14 years. Let's talk about your feelings. How do you think that's going to go? Okay? I can tell you right now, it does not go well. And a lot of these people are afraid for their lives when they try to do this work. It's not nice to anybody. It's not nice to anybody to do that. James Lawson, you're saying, hi, Josh. Long-time listener, first-time caller. Thank you. You're saying, I wanted to offer an alternative to civil war, which I hope doesn't happen, by the way. You're saying an American revolutionary renaissance seems like a better seed to plant in American minds. Okay, so I was actually having a conversation with my daughter the other day. We were talking about Donald Trump and about America and about civil unrest. And I was actually I tried talking about it with some during prime time recently, we sometimes talk between segments and we were chatting about the state of America. And I was like, well, Donald Trump, he's either going to be a Romulus or he's going to be a Caesar. And they were like, who's Romulus? I was like, come on, guys, you don't know who Romulus is? I talked about this with my daughter, and she knew exactly what I was talking about, okay? This is how I see it. So what happened, and look, I like any decent American man, I was thinking about Rome the other day, right? And I was thinking about the two times that Rome basically had what we're seeing now, which was kind of a figure like Trump. Okay, I'm just going to put it this way. A figure like Trump. What does Trump represent? Trump represents basically a very brash, a very kind of aggressive form of establishing a new system, which is why people don't like him, right? Well, I should rephrase it, which is why some people like him and some people really, really, really don't like him. He's very brash. He's very aggressive. He's very non-lenient with his enemies. He's that type. Julius Caesar, during the Roman Civil War, was very much that type. The people loved him. The Roman Senate despised him. That's why they killed him, actually. It's why they had a full-blown civil war. The military loved him. All the tribes hated him. They hated him, right? And what did he do? Well, he overthrew the Roman Republic and he established the Roman Empire. He established them as, you had an emperor instead of a republic, right? He brought an end to the Roman Republic. And of course, long story short, Julius Caesar was killed, and then, you had a Caesar Augustus come in, slight cultural reforms establishing the empire, and then you had tyrant after tyrant after tyrant. You had Caligula, and you had Tiberius, and then you had 200 years or so of persecution of Christians. It was horrible, horrible. I'm a big fan of Julius Caesar. I think that had Caesar won, had he not been killed after winning, he probably would have established a pretty good system, but he was never allowed to. So that's one way America could go, right? Trump basically changes the system, and then you have tyrants come in after him, right? The real question, my point is this: you can establish a new system. You can get rid of corruption. You can eliminate the problems. The big question is who comes after. So when I said that you can Trump will either be a Caesar or a Romulus, what I meant was this. Romulus, the first king of Rome, right? Who came after Romulus? Numa. Numa, and he, this is me being cheesy, I guess. Numa is my favorite historical king. I love Numa. I think Numa is one of the greatest kings in history. One day when I'm an old man, I plan to write many books. It'll happen one day. And I actually want to write a book about the wisdom of sage kings because I'm a big fan of reading about sage kings. I love King Numa. King Rolf Krake, I think, was a sage king, a very good king. Great book, the Saga of Rolf Krake. I think there are a lot of great, Chinese sage kings. I think there are a lot of great sage kings in other countries, and I'd love to write a book on that one day. But Numa, what did Numa represent? Let me explain that. I talked about Caesar and the way we could go with that. We could go into just 200 years of tyranny, right? We risk that. Or we could go into what happened with Romulus and Numa. So what happened in the early Roman Empire? Romulus comes in, establishes Rome. They do some bad things, okay? They might have abducted all their wives from a neighboring tribe and made them their wives. You know what I mean? It didn't work out so well. And then they had to deal with the fact, hey, rival tribe of the family of the girl I might have kidnapped to make my wife, we should find a way to build an empire together. And of course that created a bit of a conflict because the Romans wanted to keep Rome as Romans, right? Not of the, the Scythians, I believe it was. And so, they had a big argument. Romulus was a conqueror. Romulus was a warrior. Romulus was a fighter. He was the guy who violently, brutally, aggressively established the empire. Agree with me or not, but I see Trump as kind of that type, a very brash, aggressive guy establishing kind of a new system. He represents that, a cleaning out of the problems he believes existed and the establishing of a new system. You need a guy who's kind of brutal to do that. Romulus dies. The kingdom says, well, geez, what do we do now? They try to negotiate with the Scythians. How do we keep we have this new country, how do we keep it, right? The Romans obviously want a Roman, the Scythians obviously want a Scythian, and they can't agree on it. Finally, they come to an agreement. The Romans say, okay, I'll tell you what. We will select one of your people, but we get to choose. And that was the agreement. And they said Numa. And when they said Numa, everybody said, great, amazing, wonderful. If you can get Numa, everybody could agree on Numa. Everyone could agree on Numa. Numa was a wandering sage. Numa was like a wandering monk, right? They said Numa walked with the gods. He was a sage. And Numa did not want to be king. Numa had no interest in being king. They only convinced Numa to become king because they said that you can basically realize the virtues of heaven by doing so. And so after Romulus, the conqueror, you had Numa come in and he established the moral foundation of Rome. He established the agrarian farming culture of Rome. He established the religious foundation of Rome. He made the Vestal Virgins, kind of establishing virginity and purity as one of the, people criticize it, but really it was establishing virginity and purity as kind of a standard, right? Marital purity. He established the family values of Rome. Numa established the cultural foundation that would basically work as the backbone of the Roman Empire. And so the way I see us being able to avoid So when I said Trump is going to be a Romulus or a Caesar, that's what I was referring to. Meaning we'll have to see what comes after him. The leader who comes after will be the one who decides the kind of country we have afterwards. And so in James Lawson, you say this, that, you know, as opposed to a civil war, we need a revolutionary renaissance. What's going to be important is what is the king or the president we elect afterwards. We're going to need, it's going to happen in one of two ways. We're either going to fall into tyranny, and this is me using history as my mentor, right? We're either going to fall into tyranny, we're going to have a Caesar Augustus, maybe establishing the stability of the system, and then going into a Tiberius and a Caligula, right? It's going to be that. Or we're going to go into several hundred years of a renaissance. We're going to have a Numa. And I think it's going to depend on who we elect next. The next president will decide the future of the country. And I think the next, and it could also happen, from a cultural standpoint. It doesn't necessarily have to be the leader. I'll add one more thing because I know I'm going long today. It could also happen from the leader. Because in American history, we also saw this happen, where, you know, in the 1800s, you had, you know, the rise of human reason. You had the, you know, the Enlightenment of Europe, which was, you know, an atheistic movement. You had people basically abandoning religion, saying the progress of man negates the need for God. We have moved beyond him, and so on. And that was Europe, right? That led to communism, socialism, and tyranny. That led to genocide, that led to every horrible thing the world suffered. Under Nazism, which is National Socialism, under fascism, Mussolini was one of the top socialists in all of Europe. Under Lenin, under Mao Zedong, and everything else. It established just the most brutal, disgusting tyrants the world has ever witnessed. That was what, you know, atheism under the Age of Enlightenment brought about, or the Age of Reason, you could call it. America was starting to go that way, but America went in the opposite direction. And, you know, a lot of this was like late 1700s. The founding fathers were men of the Enlightenment, right? What happened was this. The Great Awakening took place in America. And rather than move against God, the American founding fathers moved towards God. There was a religious revival in America, and people restored religion. The founding fathers, many people note, oh, well, they were, you know, atheist and this and that. Like, some of them were early on because of the Age of Reason, actually. But many of them were actually influenced by the Enlightenment and a return to religion. So it was the revival of religion that established a lot of their ideas. It actually happened. There were actually several of these, even leading into like the, you know, several times during the 1800s. America, while Europe and the rest of the world was abandoning religion, America had restorations of religion. And it was that really established our country. And, you know, I'm a little patriotic, okay? It established what I believe is one of the greatest empires the world has ever witnessed, really. And, you know, we did establish a great system, and I believe that it's because of that moral foundation. If you're going to have free people, you need to have people capable of self-governance. And the only people capable of self-governance are people who can govern themselves, people who can regulate themselves. A lack of morality necessitates tyranny. If you destroy morality, you will necessitate tyranny. Because the only way you can have a stable society is through external force. If you have a moral people, you don't need tyranny, because people are capable of having peace amongst themselves and each other without the need of a tyrannical system. And so I would say that our choice going forward is whether we have, whether we move into tyranny or a renaissance. And a lot of that's going to be determined by what we do, what we choose for ourselves. And that's the way I view things. You know, I tend to view things through a historical lens. It's just the way I view the world. That said, everyone, thank you so much for being here. Let me know what you think in the chat. Do you agree with me? Do you think there's no chance we're going to have a Caligula? Or I hope not. We'll see. Do you think we're going to move into a new renaissance? Are we going to have the celebration of America, and that's going to be our future? You tell me. I'm curious. I do hope the future is brighter, not darker. I personally believe that will be the case, but that's just me. Let me know what you think. What do you think we need to do? What can look, I think even our chat, we have a great community. Speaking to each other. How do you think we can organize and make something better for the world? I don't know. You tell me. Let me know in the chat. That said, again, join me tomorrow at 10:30 a.m. Eastern Time. I will be remote. I'm traveling yet again. But again, I'll be talking to y'all soon tomorrow. Join me. In the meantime, share this episode. And again, help us get the word out. It does help us. That said, please take care of yourselves, stay informed, and stay free. Thank you.